My daughter sold my beach house, she said, as casually as if she were telling me she'd picked up groceries, and for a moment I thought I had misheard her, because nothing about that sentence made sense. Not the words, not the tone, not the quiet confidence in her voice, and yet there she stood in my kitchen, sunlight catching the edges of her perfectly styled hair, holding her phone like it contained proof of something I had never agreed to, never even discussed, and certainly never authorized. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask her to repeat herself. I simply looked at her the way I used to when she was a child and had done something she didn't quite understand was wrong, and I said, very calmly, "You sold what?" And she smiled, not nervously, not uncertainly, but with a kind of reassurance that told me she believed she had done something completely reasonable, something already settled, something irreversible. "The beach house, Mom," she said, setting her purse down on the counter as if this were just another Sunday visit. "It closed last week. You don't have to worry about maintenance anymore." And that was the moment I realized this wasn't confusion. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was something else entirely, something deeper, something that had been unfolding without me for far longer than I wanted to admit. The beach house wasn't just a property. It was the last place my husband had ever felt at peace. The place where we had spent every 4th of July watching fireworks reflect over the water, where the wooden floors still creaked in the same places they had 20 years ago, where his coffee mug still sat in the cabinet exactly where he'd left it the last summer before he passed, and I had held on to that house not because I needed it, but because it was the only place that still felt like us, and yet here was my daughter, standing in front of me, telling me it was gone as if she had every right to make that decision. I nodded slowly, as if I were processing the information at the same pace she expected, but inside, something had already shifted, not panic, not anger, just a quiet awareness that nothing about this situation aligned with what I knew to be true, because I remembered the paperwork. I remembered the conversations. I remembered the way my husband had insisted on setting things up properly, as he called it, making sure everything was protected, structured, untouchable in ways I hadn't fully questioned at the time. And now, standing there in my own kitchen, I realized that if my daughter believed she had sold that house, then either something had gone terribly wrong, or she had stepped into something she didn't fully understand. "That's thoughtful," I said, keeping my voice, even watching her carefully as she relaxed just a little, mistaking my calm for agreement, for acceptance, and she began to talk about buyers, about numbers, about how quickly everything had moved once the offer came in, details spilling out with the confidence of someone who had rehearsed this moment, and I let her speak. I let every word settle, because the more she explained, the clearer it became that she believed this story completely, and that was the most dangerous part of all. I reached for my glass of water, took a small sip, and set it back down without a sound, because the truth was, I wasn't upset. Not yet. I was listening, calculating, remembering, and somewhere beneath the surface of everything she was saying, there was a single, quiet certainty forming in my mind, steady and unshaken, that no matter what she thought she had done, no matter what papers she believed she had signed, the beach house was never hers to sell. I did not ask her another question after that, not because I did not have any, but because I already knew that whatever answers she gave me in that moment would not be the truth I needed. They would only be the version she believed, the version that made her feel justified. And I had learned a long time ago that when someone speaks with that kind of confidence, you do not interrupt them. You let them continue. You let them reveal more than they intend to. She moved around my kitchen like she still belonged there, opening the refrigerator, commenting on how little I kept stocked, mentioning how much easier things would be now that I did not have to deal with a second property, and each word felt carefully chosen, not cruel, not openly disrespectful, but edged with something else, something that suggested she had already decided what was best for me. Without ever asking if I agreed, I watched her the way I used to watch the tide when we stayed at the beach house, quiet, steady, knowing that what looked calm on the surface often hid a much stronger current underneath, and I began to piece things together, not all at once, but slowly, detail by detail, memory by memory, the way you solve a puzzle you did not realize you had been collecting for years. There had been small moments, things I had brushed aside at the time, documents she had offered to help organize, Conversations where she had gently suggested I simplify my finances, times when she had encouraged me to sign papers quickly because it was just routine, and I had trusted her because she was my daughter, because after my husband passed, I believed keeping things easy between us mattered more than questioning every little detail. And now those moments were returning to me with a clarity that felt almost sharp. I walked over to the sink and rinsed my glass, buying myself a few extra seconds to think, to steady the rhythm of my breathing, because the last thing I wanted was to react too soon, to show her that something was shifting inside me, that I was beginning to see the outline of something I had missed before. Did everything go smoothly? I asked, my voice even, almost curious, and she nodded immediately, too quickly, as if she had been waiting for that question. Yes, completely smooth. The buyers were eager, and the paperwork was already in order, she said. And there it was again, that phrase, already in order, repeated with the kind of ease that only comes from familiarity, not assumption. And I felt that quiet certainty settle deeper within me, because I knew exactly what in order should have looked like. I remembered the lawyer's office, the way my husband had insisted on certain protections, the way he had looked at me and said, very clearly, that no one would ever be able to touch that property without my full knowledge and direct involvement. And as I stood there in my kitchen, listening to my daughter describe a transaction that should have been impossible, I understood that whatever had happened, it had not begun last week. It had started long before that, in small, almost invisible steps, and I had been there for every single one of them without realizing what they were leading to. After she left that afternoon, the house felt quieter than usual, not peaceful, but watchful, as if every object around me was holding a memory I had overlooked, and I stood there for a long moment in the middle of my kitchen, replaying everything she had said, every detail, every confident explanation, not searching for emotion, but for inconsistencies, because emotions can mislead you, but facts rarely do. I walked slowly to the small desk in the corner of my living room where I kept my documents, the same desk my husband had insisted we use for anything important, bills, insurance, property records, everything organized in labeled folders with a precision that used to make me smile, and now felt like something far more significant. And I opened the drawer that held the file marked coastal property, my fingers steady, my breathing even, because this was not about reacting anymore. This was about confirming what I already suspected. The folder was exactly where I had left it, untouched, or at least it appeared that way. The papers neatly stacked, the original deed copies, the insurance documents, the tax statements, all the things that should exist if ownership had never changed, and I flipped through them carefully, not rushing, not skipping ahead, because sometimes the truth is not in what is missing, but in what remains exactly as it should be. There was no record of a recent sale, no transfer documents, no updated ownership filings, nothing that reflected what my daughter had described so confidently just hours earlier, and that absence told me more than any explanation she could have given, because a transaction like that does not simply happen quietly, not with a property of that value, not with the protections my husband had insisted on, and I felt that same quiet certainty grow stronger, not as a feeling, but as a conclusion. I sat down in the chair by the desk and closed the folder gently, resting my hand on top of it for a moment, remembering the day we signed those original papers, the way my husband had leaned back in his chair afterward and said, almost casually, "This way, no one can ever make decisions about it without you," and I had nodded without asking too many questions, trusting him the way I always had, never imagining I would one day need to understand exactly what he meant. I reached for my phone then, not in a rush, not with urgency, but with purpose, scrolling through my contacts until I found a name I had not called in years, the attorney who had handled most of our legal work back then, and I hesitated for only a second before pressing the call button, because I already knew that whatever was happening, whatever my daughter believed she had done, the answer was not going to come from confronting her. It was going to come from understanding the structure my husband had put in place, the one I had trusted without fully examining, and as the phone began to ring, I realized that for the first time since that conversation in my kitchen, I was not confused, I was not uncertain. I was simply following a path that had already been laid out for me long before any of this began. The line clicked, and after a brief pause, a familiar voice answered, older now, slower perhaps, but still carrying the same steady clarity I remembered, and for a moment I was taken back years, sitting beside my husband in that office, listening while decisions were made that I only half understood at the time. "Margaret Collins," I said, my tone calm, measured, as if this were a routine call, as if nothing unusual had happened, because I had already learned that the more ordinary you sound, the more clearly people respond, and there was a quiet recognition on the other end before he replied, greeting me by name with a warmth that felt unchanged despite the years that had passed. I did not explain everything at once. I did not mention my daughter or what she had claimed. Instead, I asked a simple question, one that mattered more than any accusation. "Can you remind me how the coastal property was structured?" And there was a brief silence, not confusion, but recollection, as if he were reaching back into a file he had not opened in some time, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a certainty that immediately grounded me. "That property was placed into a trust, Margaret, an irrevocable trust. Your husband was very particular about that." And I closed my eyes for a moment, not in relief, but in recognition. Because that word, irrevocable, was not one that allowed for casual changes or unauthorized decisions. He continued, explaining in careful, precise language that the trust required specific conditions for any sale, that no single individual could act alone, that documentation would need to pass through his office or another designated legal authority, and as he spoke, each sentence confirmed what I had already begun to understand, that what my daughter believed had happened could not have occurred within the structure that had been set in place. I thanked him for the clarification, keeping my voice even, resisting the urge to reveal more, because this was not the moment for reaction, it was the moment for understanding, and before ending the call, I asked one more question, quieter this time. If someone attempted to sell it without meeting those conditions, what would that mean? And there was a pause on the other end, longer this time, followed by a careful answer. It would mean the sale is not valid, and it could raise serious legal concerns depending on what was represented. And I nodded slowly, even though he could not see me, because that was all I needed to hear. When I hung up, the room felt different, not lighter, not heavier, just clearer, as if the fog that had settled over everything earlier that day had lifted enough for me to see the outline of what was really happening. And I walked back to the window, looking out at the quiet street, thinking not about what my daughter had said, but about what she believed, because there is a difference, a significant one, and understanding that difference is what allows you to move forward without losing your footing. I did not feel anger, not yet, because anger clouds judgment, and what I needed now was clarity, patience, and the ability to let things unfold just enough to reveal themselves completely, because if she had truly tried to sell something she did not have the authority to sell, then the situation was no longer just about a misunderstanding. It was about a choice she had made, a line she had crossed without fully realizing what stood on the other side of it. And as I stood there in the fading afternoon light, I understood that whatever came next, I would not need to raise my voice. I would not need to argue, because the truth, structured the way it was, would speak for itself when the time came. The next morning, I did not call my daughter, and I did not return any of the messages she had already begun to send, short, casual check-ins that carried the same tone as the day before, as if everything had already been resolved and there was nothing left to discuss, and that told me more than any explanation she could have offered, because people who believe they have done nothing wrong do not prepare for questions. They move forward as if the past has already been rewritten in their favor. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, reviewing not just the facts I now understood, but the pattern that had led to them, because this was never about one decision. It was about a series of small permissions I had given without realizing their cumulative weight. Moments when I had allowed convenience to replace attention, trust to replace verification, and as I traced those moments back, they formed a clear line, one that did not begin with my daughter's recent claim, but stretched back months, even years, into conversations I had dismissed as harmless. There was the time she had insisted on helping me streamline my paperwork after my husband passed, sitting beside me at this very table, gently guiding me through forms I did not fully read because she reassured me they were routine, her tone patient, almost comforting. And I remembered how grateful I had been not to handle everything alone, how easily I had signed where she pointed, trusting that her intentions matched her words. Then there were the calls about the beach house itself, suggestions that it might be too much for me to maintain, that the taxes were unnecessary, that I deserved something simpler, something closer, and each time I had smiled and said I would think about it, never committing, never agreeing, but also never realizing that the conversation itself might have been laying the groundwork for something more deliberate. I stood up and walked to the cabinet, where I kept older files, the ones I rarely needed but had never thrown away, and I began to search through them with a different perspective now, not as someone looking for reassurance, but as someone looking for evidence, because if there had been any shift, any change, any attempt to alter ownership or authority, it would have left a trace somewhere, and I was determined to find it. One by one, I opened folders, scanning signatures, dates, not rushing, not skipping, until I came across a document I did not immediately recognize, tucked between two familiar records, its edges slightly more worn as if it had been handled more than once, and I pulled it out carefully, reading the title slowly, feeling that same quiet clarity settle deeper as I recognized the language, a limited authorization form, one that granted temporary handling of certain financial matters under specific conditions, and I remembered signing it, vaguely, during a time when everything had felt overwhelming, when decisions had blurred together, and I had relied on her to guide me through them. I sat back down with the paper in my hands, not alarmed, not yet, but aware that this might be one of the pieces that connected everything, because if she had interpreted that document differently than I had intended, or worse, used it beyond the scope it was meant for, then what she believed she had done was built on something that was never meant to support it. And as I folded the paper carefully and placed it back on the table in front of me, I understood that I was no longer searching for answers. I was assembling them, piece by piece, into something that would eventually leave no room for misunderstanding at all. I did not rush to any conclusions after finding that document, because I understood that a single piece of paper, no matter how suspicious it seemed, was not enough on its own, and the last thing I wanted was to misinterpret something the way my daughter clearly had. So instead I laid it flat on the table and read it again, slower this time, paying attention not just to the main paragraphs but to the smaller print, the conditions, the limitations, the exact wording that most people tend to overlook when they trust the person sitting across from them. It granted her temporary authority to assist with specific financial tasks, limited in scope, limited in time, and clearly tied to my direct oversight, which meant that whatever she believed she had done with the property could not have been supported by this document alone. And that realization did not make me angry. It made me certain, because certainty is far more useful than emotion when you are trying to understand something that has already been set in motion. I folded the paper neatly and placed it beside the other documents, then reached for my phone again, not to call my daughter, but to take the next step in a way that would give me information rather than explanations. And I dialed the county records office, the same office that would have processed any official transfer of property ownership if such a transfer had actually taken place. The woman who answered spoke in a calm, practiced tone, and I asked my question simply, providing the address of the beach house, requesting confirmation of any recent changes in ownership, and there was a pause as she searched, a few seconds of quiet that felt longer than they were, not because I was anxious, but because I already knew what she would find. When she spoke again, her answer was straightforward, unchanged ownership, no recent filings, no pending transfers, nothing that reflected a completed sale, and I thanked her politely before ending the call, because that was all I needed, not reassurance, but confirmation. I sat there for a moment, looking at the documents spread across the table, the authorization form, the original records, the absence of anything new, and I allowed the full picture to settle into place, not as a question, but as a sequence, because what had happened was no longer unclear. It was simply incomplete from my daughter's perspective. She had acted, or at least believed she had acted, based on something that gave her a sense of authority. Whether that came from misunderstanding, assumption, or something more deliberate, I could not say yet, but what I did know was that the reality of the situation had not changed. The property remained exactly where it had always been, legally, structurally, immovable without the proper conditions being met. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes for a brief moment, not out of exhaustion, but to gather my thoughts, because the next step was not about proving her wrong. It was about allowing the truth to surface in a way that could not be dismissed or argued away, and that required patience, timing, and the willingness to let her continue believing. What she believed just long enough for that belief to meet something it could not withstand. When I opened my eyes again, the room looked the same as it had an hour ago, the same table, the same papers, the same quiet afternoon light coming through the window, but everything felt different, not because anything had changed around me, but because I now understood exactly where I stood within it, and more importantly, where she did not. By the afternoon of the following day, I had already decided what I was going to do, not in the sense of confronting her or correcting her, but in the quieter, more effective way of allowing events to continue just as she expected them to, because there is a certain clarity that only reveals itself when people believe they are in control, and I wanted to see exactly how far she thought the situation had gone. I returned her call then. Not immediately, not with urgency, but with the same calm tone I had used before, and she answered quickly, almost too quickly, as if she had been waiting for me to respond, and I could hear a subtle shift in her voice, something lighter, more confident, as though my silence had been interpreted as acceptance rather than consideration. "I have been thinking about what you said," I told her, keeping my words measured, deliberate, and there was a pause on her end, followed by a small exhale of relief that she did not bother to hide. "I am glad," she replied, and then she began to explain again, repeating details I had already heard, adding new ones this time, timelines, figures, even mentioning that the buyers were eager to finalize everything soon, and I listened without interruption, because each additional detail gave me a clearer picture of what she believed was already in motion. "They are planning to move forward quickly," she said, "and it would be easier if you could just confirm everything on your end." And that was the moment I understood exactly where this was heading, not just a claim of something already done, but an attempt to pull me into validating it after the fact, to align reality with her version of events through my agreement. I let a brief silence settle between us before responding, not refusing, not agreeing, but offering just enough to keep things moving. "If there is paperwork that needs my attention, I will review it," I said, and that seemed to satisfy her completely, because she immediately shifted into a tone of reassurance, explaining how simple it would be, how everything had already been prepared, how all that remained was a final step, and as she spoke, I realized that whatever she had initiated was not yet complete. It was still in progress, still dependent on something she did not fully understand, she could not obtain. After we ended the call, I placed my phone down carefully and sat for a moment in silence, not because I needed time to think, but because I wanted to let the situation settle into its natural shape, because now it was clear this was not about something that had already happened, it was about something she was trying to make happen, and there is a difference between those two things that cannot be ignored. I stood up and walked to the window again, looking out at the same quiet street, the same stillness that had surrounded me all week, and I felt that same steady certainty remain unchanged, because the truth had not shifted, the structure had not changed, and no matter how confidently she moved forward, she was moving toward something that would not hold, and as I turned back toward the table where the documents still lay neatly arranged, I understood that I did not need to stop her. I only needed to let her continue until she reached the point where the reality she believed in could no longer support itself. 2 days later, she called again, her voice carrying a kind of controlled excitement that she was trying to keep casual, but it was there beneath every word, the subtle urgency of someone who believes they are close to finishing something important, and I could almost picture her pacing, phone in hand, waiting for me to confirm what she needed. "Mom, the buyers are ready to finalize," she said, her tone light but expectant. "They just need one last confirmation, so everything can move forward." And I did not answer right away, not because I was unsure, but because silence has a way of making people reveal more than questions ever could. And right on cue, she continued, filling that space with additional details, mentioning documents, signatures, timelines, each word reinforcing the same assumption that I was simply a final step in a process she believed was already complete. I sat at my kitchen table, the same documents still neatly arranged in front of me, and I let my fingers rest lightly against the edge of the paper, grounding myself not in emotion, but in fact, because facts do not shift, they do not bend to belief. They remain exactly where they are no matter how confidently someone tries to move around them. "Send me what needs to be reviewed," I said finally, my voice even, neutral, giving nothing away, and there was a brief pause before she responded, as if she had not expected me to be so composed. But then she recovered quickly, assuring me that everything would be sent over shortly, that it was all straightforward, that there was nothing complicated about it. And I almost smiled at that, not because it was amusing, but because it confirmed what I already knew, that she did not fully understand the structure she was trying to navigate. When the email arrived later that afternoon, I opened it without hesitation, scrolling through the attached documents carefully, not rushing, not reacting, just observing, and what I saw was exactly what I had expected. Forms prepared for a transaction that assumed authority she did not actually possess, language that implied ownership without meeting the conditions required to establish it, and it was not chaotic or careless. It was organized, professional even, which made it all the more revealing, because it showed that whatever she had done it with intention, with planning, with a belief that she had everything under control. I closed the document and leaned back in my chair, letting the quiet of the room settle around me, because this was the point where most people would react, would call, would confront, would demand answers. But I understood now that reaction was not necessary. Not when the situation was already moving toward a conclusion on its own. Instead, I forwarded the documents to the attorney, the same one who had confirmed the structure of the trust, adding only a brief note asking him to review them, nothing more, nothing less, because I did not need to explain what I already knew he would see. As I set my phone down again, I felt no urgency, no need to rush the outcome, because whatever came next would not depend on what I said or did in that moment. It would depend on the reality that had been in place long before any of this began, and as the late afternoon light stretched across the table, illuminating the edges of the papers in front of me, I understood that my role in this was not to stop what was happening, but to allow it to reach the point where it could no longer continue without revealing exactly what it was. The response from the attorney came the next morning, not rushed, not alarmed, but precise, the way professionals respond when they recognize a situation that speaks for itself, and I read his message slowly, taking in each word without reacting, because I had already reached my conclusion, and this was simply confirmation placed into clear language. He explained that the documents I had forwarded could not legally transfer ownership under the structure of the trust, that any representation suggesting otherwise would not hold under review, and that proceeding with such a transaction could trigger formal scrutiny depending on how it had been presented to the buyers, and I nodded slightly as I read, not surprised, not unsettled, just aware that the moment I had been waiting for had quietly arrived. Later that afternoon, my daughter called again, her voice carrying a different tone this time, still composed, but tighter, as if something had shifted beneath the surface of her confidence. "Mom, have you had a chance to look at everything?" she asked, and I could hear the expectation in her question, the assumption that I would simply confirm, that I would step into the role she had already assigned to me in this situation, and I let a brief silence settle between us before I answered, not to create tension, but to give my words the space they needed. "I did," I said, my voice steady, unchanged. And there was a pause on her end, a subtle hesitation, as if she were waiting for the approval that did not come. "And," she asked, and that single word carried more uncertainty than anything she had said before. I stood by the window as I spoke, looking out at the same quiet street, the same stillness that had framed this entire situation, and I chose my words carefully, not to accuse, not to explain, but to state what could not be altered. "The property is still exactly where it has always been," I said, and there was a silence on the other end, longer this time, not filled with explanations, not followed by immediate reassurance, just silence, the kind that appears when belief meets something it cannot move past. She began to speak then, quickly at first, trying to reconcile what I had said with what she thought she had done, mentioning the buyers again, the paperwork, the process she believed was already complete, and I did not interrupt her. I did not correct her. I simply listened until her words slowed, until the certainty in her voice began to unravel on its own. "You did not sell that house," I said finally, not sharply, not loudly, but with a calm that left no room for interpretation, and another silence followed, heavier this time, as if the weight of what she was beginning to understand had finally settled. I did not need to explain the trust. I did not need to reference documents or legal structures, because the truth did not require reinforcement. It was already there, unmovable, unchanged by anything she had attempted, and as I stood there holding the phone, I realized that this had never been about stopping her or proving her wrong. It had been about allowing her to reach this moment on her own, the point where what she believed no longer aligned with what existed. And when she finally spoke again, her voice was quieter, not defensive, not confident, just uncertain, and I closed my eyes briefly, not out of relief, but out of understanding, because some lessons do not come from being told, they come from realizing, too late, that what you thought you controlled was never yours to begin with.